The late summer sun hung lazily in the sky as 12-year-old Destiny finished her math homework at the kitchen table. Through the window, she could see the moving truck pulling away from the house next door, leaving behind their new neighbor, an elderly white lady who seemed to move with careful, measured steps. Destiny had lived in this house her whole life, watching neighbors come and go, but something about this new arrival caught her attention. Maybe it was the collection of wind chimes the movers had carefully hung on the porch, or perhaps the way the old lady had stood watching them unload her belongings with a tissue clutched tightly in her hand. "Remember what I always say about minding our own business," her mom called from the living room, almost as if she could read Destiny's thoughts. But before Destiny could respond, something made her sit up straighter in her chair. Through the window, she spotted their new neighbor struggling with several grocery bags, trying to manage both her walking cane and the heavy load. The elderly woman had parked her old blue Volvo in the driveway, and now she was attempting to carry what looked like far too many bags for someone her age. One bag tilted dangerously, threatening to spill oranges across the concrete. Destiny felt her heart jump into her throat. Her mom's words echoed in her head, but sometimes, she reasoned, being a good person meant following your heart instead of the rules. Without a second thought, she slipped on her shoes and headed for the door. "I'm just going to check something, Mom," she called out, already halfway down their front steps. The afternoon air was thick with humidity, making her braids stick to the back of her neck as she jogged across the lawn that separated their houses. "Ma'am," Destiny called out softly, not wanting to startle the older woman. "Would you like some help with those bags?" The elderly woman turned slowly, her pale blue eyes widening slightly at the sight of Destiny. There was a moment, brief but noticeable, where something like uncertainty flickered across her face. Destiny had seen that look before, and her stomach tightened, but she kept her friendly smile firmly in place. "Oh," the woman said, adjusting her grip on the bags. She paused, seeming to wage some internal debate. A single orange chose that moment to escape its bag, rolling toward Destiny's feet. Without hesitation, Destiny scooped it up and held it out to her new neighbor. Something in the simple gesture seemed to soften the older woman's expression. "That's very kind of you, dear," she said finally, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "These bags are rather heavy. I'm afraid I'd overestimated my strength at the grocery store. My dad always says our eyes are bigger than our arms at the store," Destiny said with a gentle laugh, already reaching for some of the bags. "I'm Destiny, by the way. We live right next door." "Mrs. Thompson," the older woman replied, allowing Destiny to take several bags. "Eleanor Thompson. I just moved in today, though I suppose that's rather obvious." As they made their way up the driveway together, Destiny noticed Mrs. Thompson's hands shaking slightly as she tried to manage both her cane and the remaining bags. Without making a fuss about it, Destiny slowed her pace to match the older woman's careful steps. The simple act of carrying groceries somehow turned into a moment of unexpected connection. Mrs. Thompson asked about Destiny's school as they walked, and Destiny found herself drawn to the gentle lilt in the older woman's voice. There was something about her that reminded Destiny of the librarian at school who always saved the best new books for her. By the time they reached the front door, Mrs. Thompson's initial reserve had melted considerably. As she fumbled for her house keys, Destiny caught the scent of something familiar, the same lavender perfume her grandmother used to wear. The recognition made her smile. "Would you like me to help put these away?" Destiny offered, noting how tired Mrs. Thompson looked after their short walk. From somewhere behind them, Destiny heard her mother's voice calling her name, probably wondering where she disappeared to. For a moment, both Destiny and Mrs. Thompson turned to look back across the lawn, where Destiny's mother stood on their porch with a questioning expression. And there they stood, 3 women spanning 3 generations, separated by years and experiences, but connected by a simple act of kindness on a warm summer afternoon. None of them could have known then at this moment, with its grocery bags and rolling oranges, would be the beginning of something extraordinary. The next few days passed quietly, with Destiny watching Mrs. Thompson through her bedroom window as the elderly woman tried to settle into her new home. She noticed how Mrs. Thompson would sit on her porch each morning with a cup of tea, staring at her overgrown garden with a look that seemed caught between worry and longing. One particularly warm morning, while Destiny was helping her mom water their own flower beds, she couldn't help but notice Mrs. Thompson struggling to pull weeds from her garden path. The older woman would bend down slowly, grab a few weeds, then have to rest against her cane before trying again. "Mom," Destiny whispered, "do you think we could help her? Her garden looks like it needs a lot of work." Her mother paused, water hose in hand, studying their elderly neighbor. "Sometimes people need to ask for help before they're ready to receive it, baby," she said softly. "We don't want to overstep." But fate had other plans. As Mrs. Thompson reached for another weed, her cane slipped on the morning dew, and she let out a small gasp. Without thinking, Destiny rushed over, her shoes getting soaked as she crossed the wet grass. "Are you okay, Mrs. Thompson?" she called out, her heart racing a little. Mrs. Thompson straightened up slowly, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Oh yes, dear. Just these old legs of mine aren't what they used to be." She attempted a smile, but Destiny could see the frustration in her eyes. "You know," Destiny said carefully, "my mom taught me a lot about gardening. We could help you if you'd like. You shouldn't have to do all this by yourself." For a moment, Mrs. Thompson was quiet, looking between Destiny and her mother, who had moved closer to the fence that separated their yards. The morning sun caught the silver in Mrs. Thompson's hair, and something in her expression softened. "I used to have such beautiful roses," she said finally, her voice carrying a hint of sadness. "My husband, Robert, he loved gardening. We'd spend every weekend out here together." She paused, running her hand along the wooden handle of her cane. "Since he passed, I haven't been able to keep up with it all." Destiny's mom stepped forward then, her gardening gloves still on. "I'm Linda," she said warmly. "We've got some extra tools if you'd like some help. Sometimes a garden needs a few extra hands to bring it back to life." What started as a tentative offer turned into a morning of shared work and surprising laughter. Mrs. Thompson sat in her porch chair, directing them to where her prized roses used to grow, telling stories about each plant and flower as they worked. "The yellow ones," she said, pointing to a spot near the fence, "those were Robert's favorites. He said they reminded him of sunshine, even on cloudy days." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if each memory was bringing back a piece of herself. As they worked, other neighbors began to notice. Mr. Chen from across the street waved as he collected his morning paper. The Rodriguez kids rode by on their bikes, slowing down to watch the transformation taking place in Mrs. Thompson's yard. By lunchtime, they had cleared most of the weeds, and Mrs. Thompson insisted they come in for lemonade. Destiny watched in amazement as her mother and Mrs. Thompson chatted in the kitchen, their earlier hesitation melting away like morning frost in the sun. The walls of Mrs. Thompson's house were covered with old photographs, faces from different decades smiling down at them. One particular photo caught Destiny's eye, a younger Mrs. Thompson standing proudly in front of a garden bursting with colors. "That was taken 30 years ago," Mrs. Thompson said, noticing Destiny's interest. Perhaps we could make it look like that again." There was a question in her voice, a hope that hadn't been there before. Destiny looked at her mother, who nodded with a smile. "We'd love to help," Destiny said, and she meant it. Something was changing between these two houses, these two families. Like the garden they were planning to restore, something new and beautiful was beginning to grow. The garden project quickly became the highlight of Destiny's after-school routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she'd rush home, change out of her school uniform, and head next door, where Mrs. Thompson would be waiting with gardening gloves and a notebook full of plans. On this particular afternoon, the spring air was filled with the sweet scent of newly planted flowers. Destiny was carefully placing young rose bushes into the ground, while Mrs. Thompson sat in her favorite lawn chair, sharing stories about her years as a high school teacher. "You remind me of some of my favorite students," Mrs. Thompson said, watching Destiny pat the soil around a plant. "Always eager to learn, never afraid to get your hands dirty." She smiled, adjusting her sun hat against the afternoon glare. "Though I must say, none of them ever helped bring my garden back to life." Destiny grinned, wiping sweat from her forehead with her sleeve. "Did you teach them about flowers too?" she asked, carefully measuring the space for the next rose bush, just as Mrs. Thompson had shown her. "Oh, goodness no," Mrs. Thompson chuckled. "I taught English literature. But gardens and books aren't so different, you know. Both need tender care to grow, and both can tell wonderful stories." As they worked, neighbors would often stop by to admire their progress. Today, little Amy from 2 houses down stood at the fence, her eyes wide with wonder at the transformation taking place. "Can I help too?" she asked shyly, her small fingers curled around the fence pickets. Mrs. Thompson exchanged a warm glance with Destiny. "Well," she said, "we could always use another pair of hands. But you'll have to ask your mother first." Soon, Amy joined them, and Mrs. Thompson's garden became a classroom of sorts. She taught the girls about different soil types, how to tell when plants needed water, and why some flowers turned to face the sun. Her voice grew stronger with each lesson, as if teaching again had awakened something inside her. "Now see how these leaves are turning yellow," she explained, pointing to a struggling plant. "That's the soil telling us a story. It needs more nutrients." She reached for her cane and slowly stood up. "I think I have just the thing in my garden shed." As Mrs. Thompson made her way to the shed, Destiny noticed how much steadier she seemed these days. The regular activity in the garden had brought color to her cheeks and a sparkle back to her eyes that hadn't been there when she first moved in. Inside the shed, they found old garden tools, bags of fertilizer, and something unexpected: a dusty box filled with garden photos from years past. Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled slightly as she pulled out a faded picture. "This was my first garden," she said softly, showing them a photo of a much younger version of herself standing proudly among blooming flowers. "I was just a bit older than you, Destiny. My mother taught me everything I know about gardening, just like I'm teaching you now." As the afternoon light began to fade, Destiny's mom came over with a pitcher of homemade lemonade and cookies. They all sat on Mrs. Thompson's porch, dirty from gardening, but happy, sharing stories and dreams for the garden's future. "You know," Mrs. Thompson said, looking at their day's work, "I never thought I'd have a garden like this again. After Robert passed, it just seemed too overwhelming." She reached over and patted Destiny's hand. "But sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them, wrapped in packages we never thought to look for." Amy's mother came to collect her as the sun began to set, and the sight of all of them together, different ages, backgrounds, and families, made Mrs. Thompson's eyes shine with tears of joy. "Same time next week?" Destiny asked, gathering her gardening tools. "Of course, dear," Mrs. Thompson replied, her smile as warm as the evening sun. "These roses won't grow themselves, and I have so much more to teach you." As Destiny walked home that evening, she realized that they were growing more than just a garden. They were growing friendship, understanding, and a sense of community that was spreading through their neighborhood like the roots of their newly planted roses, quiet but strong, reaching out in all directions, connecting everything it touched. The weather forecast had warned of storms, but nobody expected anything this severe. Dark clouds rolled in during the early evening, bringing with them fierce winds that made the trees dance wildly. Destiny sat at her window, watching as the sky turned an ominous shade of green. "Baby, get away from that window," her mom called from the living room, where she was gathering emergency supplies: flashlights, batteries, and bottled water. Destiny's dad was securing the back door, making sure everything in their yard was safely stored away. Then it happened. With a loud crack, the entire neighborhood plunged into darkness. Through the rain-streaked window, Destiny could barely make out Mrs. Thompson's house next door. All she could see was darkness where warm lights usually glowed. "Mom," Destiny said, her voice filled with worry. "Mrs. Thompson is all alone over there." She remembered how their elderly neighbor had mentioned being afraid of storms, a fear that had grown worse since losing her husband. Her parents exchanged knowing looks. "Get your rain jacket," her dad said, already reaching for his own coat. "We'll check on her." The short walk to Mrs. Thompson's house felt much longer in the howling wind and rain. They ran as fast as they could, huddled together, with Destiny's dad holding a powerful flashlight to guide their way. When they reached Mrs. Thompson's porch, they could hear her voice trembling as she called out, "Who's there?" Through the door. "It's the Williams family," Destiny's mom answered. "We came to make sure you're okay." The door opened slowly, revealing Mrs. Thompson clutching a small battery-operated lantern. Her face, illuminated by its soft glow, showed both fear and relief. "Oh, thank heavens," she whispered, her hands shaking slightly. "I was trying to find my emergency radio, but I can't see anything in this darkness. Why don't you come over to our house?" Destiny suggested, looking hopefully at her parents. "We have a generator that kicks in during blackouts." Mrs. Thompson hesitated for just a moment before nodding gratefully. "Let me just get my medication and a few things." Destiny's dad helped her gather what she needed, using his flashlight to guide them through the dark house. Back at the Williams house, the generator hummed steadily, providing enough power for basic lighting and the refrigerator. They settled in the living room, where Destiny's mom had created a cozy atmosphere with battery-operated candles. "I haven't experienced a storm like this since I was a young girl in Michigan," Mrs. Thompson said, wrapping her hands around a warm cup of tea that Destiny's mom had prepared. "Back then, we'd all gather in the basement and tell stories to distract ourselves." "Well, we have plenty of stories to share," Destiny's dad smiled, settling into his favorite armchair. "And plenty of time to share them." As the storm raged outside, their living room became a haven of warmth and friendship. Mrs. Thompson told them about growing up in Michigan, about meeting her husband at a town dance, and about their early years teaching at the same school. Destiny's parents shared stories of their own childhoods, and soon they were all laughing together, the storm's fury forgotten. Destiny curled up on the couch next to Mrs. Thompson, listening intently as the older woman described what their neighborhood had looked like 30 years ago. "The big oak tree in front of your house. I remember when it was just a sapling," she said, her eyes twinkling with memories. When the power finally came back on hours later, none of them rushed to turn on the TV or check their phones. Instead, they continued talking, sharing more stories, and even making plans for a neighborhood gathering once the weather cleared. "You know," Mrs. Thompson said softly as the storm began to fade, "I was so worried about moving to a new place at my age. But now I realize that sometimes what seems like an ending is really just a beautiful beginning." Looking around at her family and Mrs. Thompson all together, Destiny understood exactly what she meant. The storm that had seemed so frightening had brought them even closer together, proving that sometimes the scariest moments can lead to the most precious memories. One lazy Sunday afternoon, while Destiny was helping Mrs. Thompson organize her closet, they stumbled upon a dusty old trunk tucked away in the corner. Mrs. Thompson's eyes lit up with recognition, and she slowly lowered herself onto a nearby chair. "I haven't opened this in years," she said softly, running her hand across the trunk's worn leather surface. "Would you like to see what's inside?" Destiny nodded eagerly, carefully pulling the heavy trunk into the middle of the room. The brass latches were tarnished but still worked, and when they opened it together, the smell of old paper and memories filled the air. "Oh my," Mrs. Thompson whispered, lifting out a leather-bound photo album. "These are from way back when." Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the album, and Destiny settled on the floor beside her chair, ready to listen. The first photo showed a much younger Mrs. Thompson standing in front of a small schoolhouse. Her hair was dark instead of silver, but her kind smile was exactly the same. "This was my first year of teaching, 1965, she explained. Things were very different back then. As they turned the pages, Mrs. Thompson shared stories about each photograph. There was one of her and Mr. Thompson at a civil rights rally, holding hands and carrying signs. "Robert always believed in doing what was right," she said, her voice filled with pride, "even when it wasn't easy or popular." Another photo showed them both in front of their first house, paint splattered but grinning. "We bought that house when nobody thought we should," Mrs. Thompson recalled. "The neighborhood was changing, people were moving out, but we saw it as an opportunity to be part of something important." Destiny listened intently as Mrs. Thompson described how she and her husband had worked to bring their community together during difficult times. They'd hosted block parties, started a neighborhood book club, and kept their door open to anyone who needed a friend. "Look at this one," Mrs. Thompson said, pointing to a photo of a diverse group of people gathered in what looked like her old backyard. "That was our garden club. We grew vegetables and flowers, but mostly we grew friendships. Some of those people started out as strangers and ended up being family." As they dug deeper into the trunk, they found old letters, newspaper clippings, and even some of Mr. Thompson's old teaching awards. Each item had a story, and Mrs. Thompson shared them all with growing enthusiasm. "You know, Destiny," she said, holding up a faded ribbon from a garden show, "people often think that love is just about romance or family. But there's so many different kinds of love in this world. Love for your community, love for your neighbors, love for the flowers in your garden." They found more photos of Mr. Thompson in his college classroom, surrounded by students of all backgrounds. "He taught American literature," Mrs. Thompson explained. "But what he really taught was understanding. He believed that stories could help people see the world through each other's eyes." Destiny picked up a small, worn book from the bottom of the trunk. It was a diary, its pages yellow with age. Mrs. Thompson smiled when she saw it. "That's where I wrote down all my hopes and dreams when I was about your age," she said. "Would you like to hear some of them?" Together, they read through the diary entries of a young girl who dreamed of making the world a better place, one small act of kindness at a time. Destiny was amazed to see how many of those dreams Mrs. Thompson had actually accomplished. "You know what's wonderful?" Mrs. Thompson said, closing the diary gently. "Seeing how life can surprise you. I wrote in that diary about wanting to make a difference, and here I am, all these years later, still learning and sharing with a bright young girl like you." The afternoon light was growing dim when Destiny's mom came to check on them. She found them surrounded by photos and memories, both of them so engrossed in the stories that they hadn't noticed the time passing. "Every picture tells a story," Mrs. Thompson said as they carefully packed everything back into the trunk. "But the best stories are the ones we're still writing, day by day, with the people who come into our lives when we least expect them." Monday morning brought exciting news to Destiny's history class. Their teacher announced a special project about community history and civil rights, asking each student to interview someone who had lived through significant changes in their neighborhood. Destiny's hand shot up immediately. "I know exactly who I want to interview," she exclaimed, thinking of Mrs. Thompson and her trunk full of memories. Her teacher smiled and handed out the assignment sheets. That afternoon, instead of working in the garden, Destiny and Mrs. Thompson sat on the porch swing, a digital recorder between them. The gentle creaking of the swing matched the rhythm of their conversation as Mrs. Thompson shared stories that weren't just history. They were real-life experiences. "I remember when this neighborhood was very different," Mrs. Thompson began, her eyes distant with memories. "Robert and I moved here because we believed that good neighbors come in all colors and backgrounds. Some people didn't understand that back then." She told Destiny about the little things that made big changes, how she and Mr. Thompson started a community library in their garage, letting children borrow books when the main library was too far to walk to. How they organized street fairs where everyone brought food from their family traditions, sharing cultures over plates of home-cooked meals. Your teacher's mother was one of my students, did you know that? Mrs. Thompson revealed, making Destiny's eyes widen with surprise. She used to come to our house for extra tutoring. Now look at her, shaping young minds, just like I used to do. As they talked, neighbors passing by would wave and stop to add their own memories to the conversation. Mr. Chen from across the street remembered when Mrs. Thompson helped his parents learn English. Mrs. Rodriguez recalled how the Thompsons had supported her family's small business when it first opened. The best history, Mrs. Thompson explained, patting Destiny's hand, isn't just about big events and famous people. It's about ordinary people doing their best to be kind, to make things better, one small action at a time. Destiny scribbled notes frantically, trying to capture every detail. But weren't you scared? She asked. When people didn't understand what you were doing? Mrs. Thompson's smile was gentle but strong. Being scared is natural, dear, but being right is worth a little fear. Your friendship reminds me so much of those days, how the simplest things, like helping with groceries or working in a garden, can break down the biggest walls. They spent hours recording stories, only stopping when Destiny's mom brought them cool lemonade and cookies. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch as Mrs. Thompson shared her final thoughts. You know what makes me happiest? She said, watching the neighborhood children playing together on the sidewalk. Seeing how all our small efforts back then helped create this. A place where children like you can grow up seeing difference as something beautiful, not scary. When Destiny presented her project to the class the following week, she didn't just share facts and dates. She shared Mrs. Thompson's stories of hope, courage, and the power of simple kindness. She showed photos from the trunk and played clips from their recorded conversation. My neighbor Mrs. Thompson taught me that history isn't just in textbooks. Destiny concluded her presentation. It's in our gardens, our neighborhoods, and most importantly, in the connections we make with each other. Her classmates listened with real interest, asking questions and sharing their own family stories. Even her teacher wiped away a tear, remembering her own days in Mrs. Thompson's class. That evening, Destiny and Mrs. Thompson celebrated the project's success with a special dinner in Mrs. Thompson's dining room. As they enjoyed Mrs. Thompson's famous apple pie, Destiny realized that she wasn't just learning about history. She was part of making it, one friendship at a time. You know, Mrs. Thompson said, serving another slice of pie, your project reminded me that every person has the power to make history, just by being brave enough to be kind. And sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions, like helping an old lady with her groceries. They both laughed at that, remembering how their own story had begun, never knowing it would become part of their neighborhood's living history. The crisp autumn morning started like any other, with Destiny getting ready for school. But something felt different when she glanced out her window toward Mrs. Thompson's house. The lights that usually brightened the kitchen window were still dark. During breakfast, Destiny couldn't shake off her worry. Mom, something doesn't seem right. Mrs. Thompson is always up early, tending to her morning flowers. Her mother looked up from making lunches, concern crossing her face. You're right. She hasn't missed her morning garden routine in months. Just then, their phone rang. It was Mrs. Thompson's voice, but it sounded weak and frightened. Linda? I'm so sorry to bother you, but I've had a fall. I can't seem to get up, and everything's spinning. Destiny's mom sprang into action, grabbing her keys while calling 911. Honey, stay with your father. I'm going to check on Mrs. Thompson. But Destiny couldn't just stay behind. Please, Mom, let me come. She might be scared. Her mother nodded, understanding the special bond between her daughter and their elderly neighbor. They found Mrs. Thompson on her kitchen floor, still in her nightgown. She had slipped while reaching for her morning tea. Despite the situation, she managed a weak smile when she saw Destiny. My dear girl, she whispered. I was trying to be careful, but these old legs just aren't what they used to be. While they waited for the ambulance, Destiny held Mrs. Thompson's hand, telling her about the new books she'd borrowed from the library, trying to keep her mind off the pain. Her mother placed a pillow under Mrs. Thompson's head and covered her with a warm blanket. The paramedics arrived quickly, their efficiency gentle but urgent. As they prepared to take Mrs. Thompson to the hospital, Destiny felt tears welling up in her eyes. Don't worry, sweetheart, Mrs. Thompson said, reaching out to pat Destiny's cheek from the stretcher. It takes more than a fall to keep this old teacher down. The next few days were different without their daily garden talks and afternoon stories. Destiny's family took turns visiting Mrs. Thompson in the hospital, bringing her favorite flowers from her garden and updates about the neighborhood. News of Mrs. Thompson's fall spread quickly through the community. Soon, her hospital room was filled with cards, flowers, and well wishes from neighbors, former students, and even the local garden club she'd helped start years ago. One evening, while Destiny and her mother were visiting, a doctor came in with good news. Mrs. Thompson could go home, but she'd need help during her recovery. Without hesitation, Destiny's mom spoke up. We'll help. Your family now, Mrs. Thompson. The tears in Mrs. Thompson's eyes spoke volumes. I've lived alone since Robert passed, she said softly. I forgot what it felt like to have people care so much. The neighborhood rallied together during Mrs. Thompson's recovery. Mr. Chen installed better lighting in her kitchen. Mrs. Rodriguez brought over home-cooked meals. The children from the garden club made sure her beloved flowers were watered daily. Destiny spent her afternoons doing homework at Mrs. Thompson's kitchen table, just to keep her company. They'd share stories, watch old movies, and make plans for spring planting. You know, Mrs. Thompson said one afternoon, watching Destiny water the indoor plants they'd brought in for winter, sometimes life's hardest moments show us just how blessed we are. She pointed to a photo on her wall, the one of her younger self in her first garden. Back then, I thought I was just growing flowers. Now I realize I've been growing something much more precious, a community that cares for each other. Destiny looked around the living room, at the Get Well cards covering every surface, the schedule of neighbors taking turns helping out, and the fresh flowers brought daily by someone from the neighborhood. We're not just neighbors anymore, Destiny said, repeating words she'd heard her mother use. We're family. Mrs. Thompson smiled, her eyes bright with tears of joy. Yes, my dear, and family is the most beautiful garden of all. It grows stronger with every act of kindness, every shared moment, every challenge we face together. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it Mrs. Thompson's 79th birthday. Destiny had been planning something special for weeks, secretly working with her parents and neighbors to create a celebration that would show Mrs. Thompson just how much she meant to everyone. Mom, do you think we could have the party in her garden? Destiny asked one evening while helping with dinner. It's her favorite place, and now that she's feeling better, it would be perfect. Her mother smiled, chopping vegetables for soup. That's a wonderful idea. And you know what? I bet everyone in the neighborhood would love to help. The planning became a community project. Mr. Chen offered to string lights between the trees. Mrs. Rodriguez promised to bake her famous tres leches cake. The garden club kids made decorations from pressed flowers they'd saved from last summer's blooms. On the morning of the party, Destiny went to pick up Mrs. Thompson for what the older woman thought would be their usual Saturday garden check. Let me just get my hat, Mrs. Thompson said, reaching for her familiar gardening sun hat. As they walked through the side gate into the backyard, Mrs. Thompson stopped suddenly. Her garden had been transformed. Paper lanterns swayed gently in the spring breeze. Tables decorated with fresh flowers lined the garden path. And there, gathered among her beloved roses, stood what seemed like the entire neighborhood. Surprise! Everyone called out, and Mrs. Thompson's hands flew to her mouth in shock. Oh my, she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. Oh my goodness. The garden was filled with faces both old and new. Former students, now grown with children of their own, had come back to celebrate their beloved teacher. Neighbors who'd known the Thompsons for decades stood next to families who'd just moved in, all united in celebration. "This is too much," Mrs. Thompson said, but her glowing smile said otherwise. "Actually," Destiny said, taking her hand, "it's just enough. Come see what else we did." They had created a memory wall along the garden fence, displaying photos and notes from everyone whose life Mrs. Thompson had touched over the years. There were pictures from her teaching days, snapshots from neighborhood events she'd organized, and recent photos of her garden club with the local children. "Remember when you told me that gardens tell stories?" Destiny said, leading Mrs. Thompson through the crowd. "Well, we wanted to show you the story you've helped write in our neighborhood." The afternoon was filled with laughter, music, and more food than anyone could eat. Children played games on the lawn, while adults shared stories about how Mrs. Thompson had influenced their lives. One of her former students, now a teacher himself, stood up to make a speech. "Mrs. Thompson taught me more than just literature," he said. "She taught me that kindness is the greatest lesson anyone can learn." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Mrs. Thompson sat in her favorite chair, surrounded by flowers and friends. Destiny noticed she kept touching the wind chimes they'd hung together, making them sing softly in the evening breeze. "You know what's remarkable?" Mrs. Thompson said, patting the seat beside her for Destiny to join her. "When I moved here, I was worried about being alone. Now look at all this love." They watched as neighbors chatted and laughed together. Children from different families played tag around the rose bushes, and older residents shared stories with newcomers to the neighborhood. "You've created something beautiful here," Destiny's mom said, bringing Mrs. Thompson a piece of birthday cake. "Not just a garden, but a real community." Mrs. Thompson looked around at her blooming flowers and blooming friendships. "No," she said softly, "we all created this together. Every person here has added something special to make this garden grow." As evening settled in, the paper lanterns began to glow, creating a magical atmosphere. Someone started playing soft music, and couples began to dance on the lawn. The children caught fireflies in jars, only to release them again, adding their own twinkle to the night sky. "This birthday," Mrs. Thompson whispered to Destiny, "will bloom in my heart forever, just like the roses we planted together." As summer bloomed into full glory, Mrs. Thompson's garden had become more than just a beautiful space. It had transformed into the heart of the neighborhood. What started as a simple friendship between a young girl and her elderly neighbor had grown into something that touched the entire community. One warm Saturday morning, Mrs. Thompson sat in her usual garden chair, watching as Destiny taught a group of younger children how to plant marigolds. The scene before her was exactly what she and her late husband had always dreamed of: a garden where everyone belonged. Careful with those roots, Destiny instructed gently, showing a small boy how to cup the delicate plant in his hands. "Remember what Mrs. Thompson taught us. Every flower needs tender, loving care to grow." Mrs. Thompson smiled, remembering how she'd said those same words to Destiny not so long ago. Now here was Destiny, passing on that knowledge to the next generation of gardeners. The neighborhood had changed in wonderful ways over the past year. What started as garden lessons had blossomed into a weekly community gathering. Every Saturday morning, families would come together to learn about plants, share stories, and build friendships. "You know," Mrs. Thompson said to Destiny's mom, who sat nearby arranging flowers for the community center, "when I moved here, I thought I was just finding a new house. Instead, I found a whole new family." They watched as Mr. Chen taught a group of adults about traditional Chinese vegetables he'd started growing in one corner of the garden. Mrs. Rodriguez's daughters were setting up refreshments on a small table, their mother's famous lemonade already drawing people over. "It's amazing how something as simple as a garden can bring people together," Destiny's mom replied, weaving together roses and daisies. You've created something special here. Mrs. Thompson shook her head gently. No, we all created this together. Every person who's planted a seed, shared a story, or simply sat here enjoying the beauty. They're all part of this garden story. Later that afternoon, as the community gardening session was winding down, Destiny sat beside Mrs. Thompson on the porch swing. They watched butterflies dance among the flowers they'd planted together months ago. Remember when you first helped me with those grocery bags? Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice soft with memory. Who would have thought that one small act of kindness would lead to all this? Destiny looked out at their garden, because it truly was their garden now, belonging to everyone who helped tend it. Children were playing hide and seek between the flower beds, careful not to step on any plants. Parents were exchanging recipes for the vegetables they'd grown. Elderly neighbors were teaching younger ones about traditional plants from their cultures. You taught me something important, Destiny said, turning to Mrs. Thompson. You showed me that age and differences don't matter when it comes to friendship. What matters is what's in our hearts. Mrs. Thompson reached over and squeezed Destiny's hand. And you, my dear girl, taught me that it's never too late to start something new, to make new friends, to create something beautiful. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, neighbors started gathering for their weekly community dinner. Tables were set up among the flowers, each family bringing a dish to share. The air was filled with laughter, the clinking of plates, and the soft murmur of conversations in different languages. This, Mrs. Thompson said, looking out at the scene before them, this is what Robert and I always dreamed of. A place where everyone feels at home, where friendships grow as naturally as flowers. Destiny helped Mrs. Thompson down the porch steps, walking slowly toward the gathering. Every few steps, someone would greet them, share a story, or thank Mrs. Thompson for some piece of garden wisdom she shared. You know what's wonderful about gardens? Mrs. Thompson said as they reached the tables. They never stop growing, never stop changing. Just like the friendships we plant and tend with care. Looking around at the faces lit by the evening sun, faces of different ages, colors, and backgrounds, all sharing food and friendship in their garden, Destiny understood exactly what Mrs. Thompson meant. They had created something rare and precious, a place where love grew wild and free, where friendship bloomed in every season, and where every person who entered left with their heart a little fuller than before.